I've been married to Stephanie for 6 years. We met when I was fresh out of college, working long hours trying to build a name for myself. She was everything I thought I wanted: funny, charming, and a bit of a dreamer. She'd often talk about her big ideas for the future, but somehow, those ideas never seemed to materialize into action. I didn't mind at the time. I was in love, and I believed I could support us both until she found her footing. For years, I worked myself to the bone while Stephanie stayed home. At first, she claimed she was trying to find her passion, but as time went on, I realized she wasn't putting much effort into anything. Our roles became clear. I was the breadwinner, and she was, well, a consumer. She had expensive tastes, and I didn't mind footing the bill as long as I could keep her happy. But lately, something had shifted between us, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Stephanie's father, a man I'd always admired, passed away about a month ago. He was a self-made millionaire who'd built his empire from the ground up. I knew his death hit her hard. At least I thought it did. She cried at the funeral, but not the way I expected. Her tears seemed rehearsed, like she was playing a role. I didn't want to question her grief. Everyone processes loss differently, right? But that's when the changes began. At first, it was small things. She started going out more often, claiming she needed time to clear her head after losing her dad. She'd stay out late with her friends or take sudden trips to the spa, always brushing off my questions with vague answers. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around carelessly, was now glued to her hand. She had a new password, one she conveniently forgot to share with me. One night, I walked into the living room and found her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone with a look I couldn't quite read. When she noticed me, she quickly locked the screen and forced a smile. "Oh, hey, just looking at some ideas for a memorial for Dad," she said, her voice just a little too cheerful. I didn't push. Maybe I should have. Then there was the money. Stephanie, who had always been carefree with spending, suddenly became obsessed with finances. She started talking about new beginnings and how life was too short to settle for mediocrity. At first, I thought it was her way of dealing with grief, but deep down, I felt a storm brewing. The real kicker came 2 weeks ago. She started dropping hints, subtle at first, then not so much, about how she felt stuck in our marriage. One night, as we were having dinner, she sighed dramatically and said, "You know, sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd taken more risks." I asked her what she meant, but she just shrugged and said, "Nothing. Forget I said anything." Forget? As if I could. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Stephanie had always been unpredictable, but this was different. There was a distance between us that I couldn't bridge. Still, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, she'd just lost her father. But my gut wouldn't let me rest, and it wasn't long before my suspicions grew into something I couldn't ignore. The changes in Stephanie's behavior weren't just in my head. They were piling up like bricks, one on top of the other, until I could no longer ignore them. It started with her phone. She used to be the type of person who'd toss it onto the counter without a second thought. Now, it was practically glued to her hand. Whenever I entered the room, she'd lower the screen, lock it, or switch apps so fast I barely had time to register what she was doing. Once, when she left it charging in the kitchen, I heard it buzz. Curious, I glanced at the screen. The message preview was just emojis, a champagne bottle, a winking face, and a heart. She was back in the room before I could even process what I'd seen. "Who's texting you?" I asked casually, pretending I hadn't seen it. "Just Rachel," she said without missing a beat. "She's planning a girls' night and wants me to help." It might have been believable if her tone hadn't been so light, too nonchalant. Stephanie wasn't exactly subtle when she lied, but for some reason, I let it slide. Her outings became more frequent, too. She'd leave at odd hours, sometimes claiming she needed to clear her mind or run errands. But her stories didn't add up. One Saturday, she told me she was going shopping with Rachel. Later that day, I bumped into Rachel at the grocery store alone. "Oh, hey." I greeted her, trying to keep things casual. "I thought you and Stephanie were out shopping today?" Rachel blinked, clearly confused. "Stephanie? No, I haven't seen her in a while." I stood there for a moment, gripping my card handle tighter than I should have. Right? Must have misunderstood. Thanks. I didn't bring it up with Stephanie that night. I told myself I needed more proof, something concrete. But the doubt had already planted itself in my mind, and it was growing fast. The strangest incident happened a week later. She'd gone out for coffee with one of her friends and hadn't come back until after midnight. When I asked her what kind of coffee date lasted that long, she rolled her eyes and said, "We were catching up." You wouldn't get it. That might have worked if she didn't smell like perfume. Not hers. It wasn't subtle either. It was a heavy, musky scent that clung to her clothes and skin. I didn't call her out on it, though. Instead, I let it stew inside me, gnawing at my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't pull out. By this point, I was replaying everything in my head. The late nights, the lies, the phone glued to her hand. And then there was her attitude toward me. Stephanie wasn't just distant, she was cold. Conversations that used to flow freely between us now felt like walking on eggshells. When we did talk, she barely looked at me, her answers clipped and impatient. One night, as I sat alone on the couch, she came downstairs, dressed up in a way I hadn't seen in months. Tight dress, heels, hair done to perfection. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. "Out," she said, grabbing her purse without even looking at me. "With who?" "Rachel," she replied, the same name she always threw out. "Don't wait up." I didn't. But that night, I didn't sleep either. I knew something was going on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about another man. There was more to it. Something bigger. Something I hadn't yet uncovered. And then came the final piece of the puzzle, the thing that shattered whatever illusion I was holding on to and sent me down the rabbit hole of truth. I don't know what exactly pushed me over the edge, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this, second-guessing everything, drowning in suspicion, and pretending not to notice the growing distance. I had to know the truth. One evening, Stephanie went upstairs to shower after another of her mysterious outings. Her purse was sitting on the kitchen counter, and for the first time, I decided to cross a line I never thought I would. I told myself I wasn't being paranoid anymore. I was just seeking clarity. Her phone wasn't there, of course. She always kept that with her like it held state secrets. But as I opened her purse, my fingers brushed against an envelope, thick, slightly crumpled, and sealed. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. What was this? Curiosity got the better of me, and I slid the envelope out. It was addressed to her, with a return address I didn't recognize. Carefully, I opened it and pulled out a letter. My hands were trembling as I began to read. It was from a lawyer. The contents were formal but direct. Stephanie had inherited $379 million from her father's estate. The letter also outlined her immediate rights to the inheritance and included a draft of a legal agreement. What caught my attention, though, was the final line. As a reminder, the terms of this inheritance remain contingent on the conditions outlined in the will. Please refer to the attached copy for details. There was no attached copy in the envelope. Just that vague, cryptic line. My first thought was disbelief. Why hadn't she told me? How could someone inherit that much money and keep it from their spouse? My stomach twisted with the realization. She wasn't planning to keep it a secret forever. She was planning to keep it from me. As I slipped the letter back into the envelope, I heard the shower stop upstairs. Panic surged through me. I shoved the envelope back in her purse and stepped away, trying to look casual. When she came downstairs a few minutes later, her hair wrapped in a towel, she glanced at me briefly and then at her purse. I could see the faintest flicker of suspicion in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over everything in my head. The secrecy, the changes in her behavior, the lawyer's letter. It all added up to one thing. She was planning to leave me. And then it happened. The next day, as I was sitting in the living room, she walked in with a strangely calm demeanor. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. I felt my chest tighten. "What's going on?" She sighed, as if she were the one carrying some unbearable weight. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm not happy anymore. I think we should separate. It felt like the ground beneath me had been ripped away. Separate? What are you talking about? I just feel like we've grown apart, she said, avoiding eye contact. You're not the man I fell in love with. I laughed bitterly. The man you fell in love with? Stephanie, I've done nothing but support you for years. What changed? Her expression hardened. What changed is that I've realized I deserve better. I don't want to keep pretending this marriage is working when it's not. And then she said it. The words that burned themselves into my memory. You're useless to me now. Useless. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, searching her face for some hint of remorse. But there was none. Just cold indifference. I don't think you'll regret this later, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my anger was bubbling dangerously close to the surface. She shrugged. I doubt it. She left the room after that, and I sat there in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. This wasn't just about us growing apart. She'd been planning this, calculating her next move while I was in the dark. What she didn't know was that I wasn't as clueless as she thought. That lawyer's letter, it was the key to everything. And if there was one thing I was certain of, it was this. Stephanie hadn't read her father's will carefully enough. The next morning, Stephanie acted as if nothing had happened. She sat at the kitchen table scrolling on her phone, sipping her coffee like she hadn't just told me I was useless and that she wanted a divorce. Her nonchalance made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to play my cards right. I decided to confront her directly, but not in a way she'd expect. I knew Stephanie had always underestimated me. She thought I was predictable, someone she could outsmart. I intended to prove her wrong. So, I began, setting my mug down on the counter. When were you planning to tell me about the inheritance? Her head snapped up, her face a mixture of confusion and alarm. What are you talking about? The $379 million, I said flatly, watching her closely. Your father's estate. I found the letter from the lawyer. Her expression faltered for a split second before she composed herself, her face hardening. You went through my stuff? She snapped, deflecting immediately. You left it in your purse. I shot back. And considering you were about to walk out of this marriage without so much as a hint, I think I had a right to know. Stephanie stood up, crossing her arms defensively. This is exactly why I didn't tell you. I knew you'd act like this. Entitled. As if his money has anything to do with you. Entitled. I repeated, my voice rising. I've worked myself to exhaustion for years to give you a good life. I've sacrificed everything, Stephanie, my time, my energy, my dreams, and you think I'm entitled? You were going to throw me away like trash the moment you got your hands on that money. She didn't deny it. Her silence said everything. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. And let me guess, you thought you'd just waltz out of here, take the money, and leave me with nothing? Stephanie's lips curled into a bitter smile. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet. Besides, you don't need my money. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had loved, supported, and trusted had been planning this for months, maybe longer. And now, she didn't even have the decency to pretend she cared. You know what? I said, my voice low and steady. You've always underestimated me, Stephanie. But you've made one big mistake. She rolled her eyes. Oh, really? What's that? You didn't read the will, did you? Her smug expression faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. What are you talking about? She asked, her tone defensive. I leaned forward, holding her gaze. The conditions. The lawyer mentioned them in the letter, but you probably didn't bother to check. Typical. She looked uneasy now, her arms tightening across her chest. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I said, letting the silence stretch between us. You know, I always respected your father. He was a smart man, sharp as a tack, and he never trusted you with money. Stephanie's face paled, but she quickly masked it with anger. Don't you dare bring my father into this, she snapped. Oh, I'm bringing him into this, I said, standing my ground. Because if I know anything about him, it's that he wouldn't have handed over that kind of money without strings attached. He knew you too well. And now, so do I. Her composure cracked. She grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. I stayed where I was, my heart pounding. The confrontation hadn't gone the way I'd expected, but I'd hit a nerve. She didn't know the full details of the will, and I did. The lawyer's office was just a call away, and I intended to find out exactly what her father had planned. If she thought she was about to walk away with millions while leaving me with nothing, she was about to get the shock of her life. After Stephanie stormed out, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my laptop and searched for her father's lawyer's contact information. I'd met the man briefly at the funeral, a sharp-dressed, no-nonsense type who gave off the impression that he missed nothing. If anyone could confirm my suspicions about the inheritance, it was him. When I called, I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me thought he'd refuse to speak to me, citing confidentiality or legal formalities. But to my surprise, he answered after a few rings. "Mr. Callahan," I began, my voice steady even though my hands were trembling. "This is—" "I know who you are," he interrupted, his tone polite but curt. "Stephanie's husband. How can I help you?" I hesitated for a moment before diving in. I came across a letter regarding my wife's inheritance from her father's estate. There was a mention of conditions outlined in the will. I was wondering if you could clarify what those are. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his tone was different, curious, almost amused. "Has Stephanie not discussed this with you?" "No," I said firmly. "She hasn't. But I need to know." He let out a quiet chuckle, one that sent a chill down my spine. "Well, Mr. Callahan, it's quite simple. The will stipulates that Stephanie's inheritance is contingent on her being married at the time the funds are distributed. Should she divorce before the estate is finalized, the money will be redirected to a charitable trust." The words hit me like a thunderclap. I sat there, stunned, the room spinning around me. "Are you saying, if she divorces me, she gets nothing?" I asked, barely able to process what I was hearing. "Exactly," the lawyer replied, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. It was a precaution her father insisted on. He wanted to ensure she wouldn't squander the money or be influenced by temporary emotions. "I take it she didn't read the full terms?" "No," I muttered, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. "She didn't." "Well," he said, sounding thoroughly entertained, "this will certainly be an interesting situation for her. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "No, that's all," I said, my voice distant. "Thank you." I hung up and sat there, staring at the wall. It all made sense now. Her coldness, the secrecy, the sudden push for divorce. She thought she could take the money and leave me in the dust, but she had no idea that her entire plan was doomed to fail. When Stephanie came home later that evening, I was ready. She walked in, her face a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. She didn't even greet me as she set her purse down and kicked off her heels. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Can this wait? I've had a long day." "No, it can't," I replied, standing up and facing her. "I spoke to your father's lawyer today." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with alarm. "You what?" "You heard me," I said, crossing my arms. "I know everything, Stephanie. The conditions, the stipulations. I know that if you divorce me, you get nothing." Her face went pale just like I knew it would. For a moment, she was too stunned to speak, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words. That's not true," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't lie to me," I said, my tone sharper now. "You didn't bother to read the will, did you? You thought you could take the money and run, but you never stopped to think that your father might have outsmarted you." Her expression shifted, anger replacing the shock. "How dare you go behind my back like that? How dare I?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You were about to leave me with nothing, Stephanie. You lied to me, manipulated me, and tried to discard me like I was nothing. And now you're mad because I found out the truth." She didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said everything. For the first time in our marriage, I saw the real Stephanie, the selfish, calculating woman she'd been hiding behind a mask of charm and sweetness. "I hope it was worth it," I said quietly, my voice filled with both anger and sadness. Because now you've lost everything. Your father's money, your marriage, and whatever shred of respect I had left for you. She stood there, frozen, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her. I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked out of the room, leaving her to sit with the consequences of her betrayal. But I wasn't done yet. The silence in the house was deafening after I walked out of the room. I could feel Stephanie's presence lingering behind me, but I didn't turn back. I went straight to the guest room, shutting the door with finality. I needed space, clarity, and, more than anything, I needed a plan. That night, I didn't sleep much. I replayed the lawyer's words in my head over and over. Her father had thought ahead, protecting his legacy from her recklessness. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same man she was so eager to take millions from had ultimately protected me in the process. But what was I supposed to do now? She'd made it clear she didn't love me. And knowing what I knew, I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination. If Stephanie wanted to play games, fine. I play too. But on my terms. I started by calling her father's lawyer again. I needed confirmation of one last detail. Mr. Callahan, I said after he picked up, I have one more question about the inheritance. Does Stephanie need my cooperation to stay married? Or can she simply keep me on paper while we separate? He paused for a moment, then said, the will doesn't require emotional or physical proximity, just a legal marital status. However, if you were to file for divorce, the inheritance would automatically be forfeited. It's a mutual tether, so to speak. I couldn't help but smirk. So, as long as I don't agree to a divorce, she's stuck? Essentially, yes, he replied, though I'd advise against using this as leverage. It could get messy. Messy, I repeated. Mr. Callahan, I think we passed messy a long time ago. I hung up feeling more in control than I had in weeks. Stephanie had backed herself into a corner, and now, whether she liked it or not, I held the key to her future. The same man she had dismissed as useless now had all the power. Later that day, I finally confronted her again. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. The audacity of her calmness almost made me laugh. Stephanie, I said, standing in the doorway. She looked up at me, her expression wary. What now? I've decided what I'm going to do, I said, walking into the room. I'm not giving you a divorce. Her face twisted in confusion, then anger. What are you talking about? You can't just refuse to sign the papers. Actually, I can, I said, leaning against the wall. And I will. If you want that inheritance, you're going to stay married to me, on paper at least. You don't get to destroy our marriage and walk away with everything. Her jaw clenched, her hands gripping the phone in her lap. You're being petty. Petty, I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. Stephanie, you lied to me, manipulated me, and planned to leave me with nothing. And now that your plan's fallen apart, I'm the one being petty. She didn't respond, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. For the first time, she was realizing she wasn't in control anymore. Here's how this is going to work, I continued. You stay married to me, and I won't interfere with whatever you want to do with your life. You can go out, spend your days however you like, but that inheritance stays tied to me. If you push for a divorce, the money's gone. And we both know you don't want that. Her face was a storm of emotions, anger, frustration, and, for a fleeting moment, fear. You can't do this, she finally said, her voice shaking slightly. Oh, but I can, I said, holding her gaze. And I will. You made this bed, Stephanie. Now you get to lie in it. I turned and walked away, leaving her seething on the couch. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was enough for now. She'd underestimated me for too long, and I wasn't about to let her get the last laugh. What I didn't expect, though, was how quickly she'd try to turn the tables again. The days after my ultimatum were tense, to say the least. Stephanie didn't take kindly to being backed into a corner. She spent most of her time sulking, occasionally throwing passive-aggressive comments my way. But I didn't care. I had what I wanted: control. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I could breathe again. and I intended to make her feel every ounce of the betrayal she'd dealt me. At first, she tried to test the waters. One evening, she came into the living room dressed to the nines, heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "I'm going out," she announced flatly, as if daring me to react. "Have fun," I said without looking up from my laptop. Her face faltered for a moment, clearly expecting an argument or jealousy. I gave her nothing. She left without another word, slamming the door on her way out. This became a pattern. She'd leave for hours at a time, sometimes not coming home until the early morning. I didn't ask where she went or who she was with. She wanted to prove she didn't need me, but in reality, she was trying to maintain some illusion of control over her life. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just sitting idly by while she played her games. I'd been in touch with her father's lawyer again, and after a little persistence, I managed to get a copy of the full will. What I found in those pages confirmed everything I needed to know and gave me the perfect ammunition to end this once and for all. It turned out that her father's conditions for the inheritance were even stricter than I'd realized. Not only did she have to remain married to me, but any attempts to manipulate the terms, through separation, secret financial agreements, or anything that could be interpreted as an effort to undermine the marriage, would void the entire inheritance. The man had anticipated every possible loophole, and now his foresight was my weapon. I decided to confront her one last time. She came home late one night, her hair slightly disheveled and her lipstick smudged. She clearly hadn't expected me to be awake, but I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. "Where were you?" I asked casually, though my tone was laced with quiet authority. "None of your business," she shot back, kicking off her shoes. "Oh, but it is my business," I said, sliding the will across the table toward her. "Because if you keep this up, you're going to lose everything." She froze, her eyes darting to the document in front of her. "What's this?" "Your father's will," I said. "The full version. You might want to read it this time." Her hand trembled slightly as she picked it up, scanning the pages. As her eyes moved across the text, I saw the color drain from her face. This can't be right," she stammered, looking up at me. "Oh, it's right," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Every little stunt you've pulled, every late-night outing, every lie, every scheme, could be interpreted as a violation of these conditions. If the lawyer gets even a whiff of what you've been up to, the money's gone. All of it." She sank into a chair, the will slipping from her hands onto the table. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "You can't tell him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I raised an eyebrow. "Why not? You were willing to throw me under the bus for that money. Why shouldn't I do the same to you?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I wondered if she was genuinely remorseful. But then she said, "I'll do whatever you want. Just don't ruin this for me." "Whatever I want?" I repeated, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "Like staying married to me, so you can keep playing your games?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I'll be better. I'll—" "Stop," I interrupted, standing up. "I don't want your fake promises. You made your choices, Stephanie, and now you get to live with them. But here's the thing. I'm not going to tell the lawyer. Not yet. I want you to sit with this. I want you to feel what it's like to live in fear, wondering if today's the day it all falls apart." She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the weight of her actions. The real revenge wasn't in taking the money from her. It was in letting her destroy herself, one misstep at a time. And if she pushed me too far, I knew exactly how to end it all with one phone call. The days that followed were oddly quiet. Stephanie avoided me, retreating into herself like a cornered animal. She no longer dressed up to go out or made snide remarks when we passed each other in the hallway. It was as if she had finally realized the walls were closing in, and there was no way out. I gave her space, but I didn't ease up on the pressure. Every once in a while, I'd leave subtle reminders of her predicament, mentioning the lawyer in passing, casually leaving the will on the coffee table, or making offhand comments about integrity and choices. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to make her understand what she'd done. One evening, about 2 weeks after our last confrontation, she finally broke. I found her sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me as I entered the room, her expression hollow. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stopped in my tracks, surprised by the admission. "Sorry for what?" "For everything," she said, shaking her head. "For lying to you. For trying to take the money. For thinking I could just walk away from you like you didn't matter." I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at her, trying to gauge if this was genuine or another act. "I was selfish," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could have it all. I thought I didn't need you anymore. And I was wrong. I ruined everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I wanted to believe her, but the damage had been done. I couldn't forget the way she had looked at me when she said I was useless. That kind of disdain doesn't disappear overnight. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, my tone even. "But it doesn't change what happened. You betrayed me, Stephanie. You made me feel like I was nothing to you. That's not something I can just forget." She nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to say it." For the first time in weeks, she seemed vulnerable, not the cold, calculating person I'd seen lately, but the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But even so, I knew it wasn't enough to rebuild what she'd broken. "I think we both need some space," I said, standing a little straighter. "I'm not filing for divorce, and you know why. But this marriage is over in every way that matters." She didn't argue. She just nodded, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. From that moment on, our relationship became purely transactional. We lived under the same roof, but we were strangers. She spent her days quietly, staying out of my way. I focused on myself, pouring my energy into work, hobbies, and reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during the chaos. Eventually, word got back to Stephanie's lawyer about her behavior, though not from me. One of her friends spilled the truth during a drunken argument, and the lawyer contacted her with a warning. One more slip-up, and the inheritance would be gone for good. That was the final nail in the coffin. Stephanie became a shadow of her former self, terrified of making any wrong move. She stopped going out altogether, rarely even leaving the house. The money she had so desperately wanted now felt like a prison, chaining her to a life she could no longer control. As for me, I found peace in letting go. I didn't need revenge beyond what had already unfolded. Watching her unravel was enough. She had built her entire identity around that inheritance, and now it was the very thing that kept her trapped. I learned a lot about myself through all of this, about what I'm willing to tolerate, about standing up for myself, and about recognizing when someone no longer deserves my love or loyalty. To anyone reading this who's been in a similar situation, trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is, and never let anyone make you feel like you're not enough. People like Stephanie only have power over you if you let them. As for her, I don't know where life will take her, and honestly, I don't care. I'm finally free. Free of her lies, her manipulation, and her games. And that's worth more than any inheritance could ever buy.